When the name Phil Anselmo was mentioned, the whole metal community gasped. He was an unbridled beast on stage. A shadow yelling through smoke and lights, a representation of primordial wrath, where his voice was more than simply sound, it was a weapon smashing through all barriers. They referred to Phil Anselmo as Pantera's essence, the thunderous blast of 90s metal, and a fierce pulse of life pulsing through a gloomy world. A soul in pieces, however, lay underneath the multi-platinum albums and fiery performances. An isolated man in the spotlight, writhing in physical agony, engrossed in drugs. For remarks that could never be taken back, a man whose heart stopped from an overdose was vilified by the world and exiled by his closest brothers. He lived for years as though future didn't exist or wasn't something he wanted. There was never a perfect Phil Anselmo. The darkness didn't scare him. He let it consume him sometimes. His story is worth telling for precisely that reason. A path of disintegration, collapse, salvation, and endurance. Survival is a cry that continues to reverberate despite the passage of time. Really, who is Phil Anselmo? The victim of the very flame he once stoked, or the voice of a dissident generation? Is he a living legend or a spirit in exile that is still trying to find their way back? Early years. Hanson Phillip. New Orleans, Louisiana, a city full of character, jazz music, openness, and turmoil, is where Anselmo was born on June 30, 1968. His parents were Philip Anselmo, Sr., an Italian-American who maintained a classic Italian eatery with live music, and his mother, who remained in the background and dealt with unsaid issues. The family Anselmo was not impoverished. However, love in the home was never fully expressed. Phil, one of 3 siblings, saw his parents' marriage fall apart at a young age. He didn't have a close relationship with his father, it was more formal. Despite growing up surrounded by music and the vibrant ambience of his father's eatery, Phil never thought of it as his stage. Instead, he frequently felt like a stranger, someone who was not included in any frame. Phil was an energetic, slender child who exhibited impulsive and disruptive conduct early on. Due to his unruly behavior and short fuse, he was frequently transferred and subjected to continuous penalties while attending public elementary schools in New Orleans. Although he had an unimpressive academic record, his keen observational abilities and peculiar imagination were undeniable, and these qualities would eventually inspire his powerful and surprisingly profound music. Instead of sports fields or art studios, Phil's early years were characterized by noise. The loud music of Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Black Sabbath records reverberated from his bedroom, creating a private realm where he could escape the mayhem outside. Phil never took up music as a pastime. It was like a lifeline. He once said, "I didn't look to metal for amusement. It was what I needed to shout for me, so I turned to it." Although Phil first took up a guitar at the age of 14, it was his voice that started to define who he was. He began yelling, experimenting with tone, pronunciation, and the unadulterated rage that was blazing within of him without any professional training or sophisticated method. He joined local bands at this time, including Razor White and Samhain, which is not linked to Glenn Danzig's band of the same name. With his untamed stage persona and frighteningly unadulterated energy, he immediately became the center of attention. Despite living in a jazz and funk-infused city, I always felt alienated. The other children weren't like him. He didn't want to be an engineer, a doctor, or a football player. He wanted to scream till the pain subsided, get on stage, and wield a microphone. The pursuit of fame was never the aim in Phil's world. It was a fight just to be alive. After a flurry of late-night club appearances and screams during his adolescent years, he received a call from Arlington, Texas. A band that has released 3 albums but is still looking for the proper voice. A band that struggles to balance the need to be heavier, more real, and more dangerous with glam aesthetics. The person they called was Phil Anselmo. First career. When Phil Anselmo was just 18 years old in 1986, he was invited by the Texas band Pantera, who were still torn between wanting to be taken seriously in the underground scene and the gaudy lights of glam metal. They had a small fan base and 3 indie albums under their belt, but they lacked the most important component, identity. Everything changed the instant Phil entered the audition room. Merely brought a wild, fierce, and primordial energy instead of the radiance of a star. This was the missing component, and the band's guitar prodigy, Dimebag Darrell, recognized it right away. A voice that challenges the crowd rather than tries to win it. Over. Not only was Phil a singer, but he was a living proclamation, a howl from the soul that no one could ever learn or imitate. Phil and Pantera recorded power metal as their debut album. The band started to drastically change their course in 1988, a transitional album, while yet holding onto remnants of their previous work. Even if it wasn't a breakthrough yet, power metal was the first step toward losing their glossy exterior, making their sound rougher, and venturing into uncharted terrain. Additionally, the band's style and mindset completely changed with Phil's entrance. He wore dark t-shirts and cargo pants, chopped off his long hair in the glam style, got inked all over, and performed with eyes that seemed to be able to eat up the crowd. He was not only a singer on stage. He ripped down the barriers separating him from the audience, yelled, and threatened. Furthermore, the crowd roared back rather than flinching. In the meanwhile, Pantera members felt that the musical tide was turning. Glam was at its height and starting to fade. What the audience desired was more realistic. Less smooth and heavy. That's when Pantera changed their brand, instinctively rather than for the market. Pantera joined the well-known label Atco Records in 1989. It was an opportunity to start again and ultimately come out of their own shadow, not merely a business arrangement. Additionally, the first album to genuinely establish Pantera as a new heavy metal force was Cowboys from Hell, released in 1990. At the time of its release, Cowboys from Hell was just the beginning, a statement that Pantera was prepared to burn the past and set out on a one-way path, and that Phil Anselmo would become its fiery, unforgiving soul. However, it would subsequently be acclaimed as a pioneering record of the decade. The commercial boom and internal breakdown that ensued would be a very different story. For Phil alone, however, the transformation from a boisterous, mischievous child in New Orleans to the voice of a new metal movement was sufficient evidence. He wasn't only a Pantera member. He brought it back to life. Professional breakthrough. Upon the formal release of Cowboys from Hell in 1990, Pantera did more than simply release a new album. They updated the heavy metal map. Vinnie Paul's oppressively tight drums, Phil Anselmo's eerie guttural screams, and Dimebag Darrell's razor-sharp riffs all contributed to the record's newfound vibrancy. It was a kind of metal that depended on planned cruelty rather than speed. It was dubbed groove metal. However, to those who experienced it, it was just the sound of the unadulterated, black, and unpolished reality. There was no one else who sounded like Phil at the time. He didn't try to wow his audience with silky vocals or use strangeness to get a reaction. He screamed from the bottom of his heart with a ferocious intensity, as though each line were a blow to the listener's chest. He was more than simply a performer on stage. He was a warrior who had been wounded and was dragging his scars into the spotlight, shouting into them until quiet finally gave way. The triumph of Cowboys from Hell was not immediate, rather, it spread underground like wildfire. In the metal scene, Phil was praised as a representation of unadulterated honesty in both emotion and lifestyle, while Pantera was seen as the future. No polishing, no pretending, no acting. He just was himself. Strong. Uncooked. Unrepentant. After traveling non-stop for almost 2 years, Pantera went back to the studio in 1992, but this time they intended to declare war rather than merely follow up. The outcome was one of the most significant albums in the history of contemporary heavy metal, vulgar display of power. From Mouth for War's nerve-shredding riff to this love-suppressed seething scream to Walk's timeless hymn with its unwavering message, it was a manifesto for a generation that was disenchanted with religion and authority. Society, as well as the family. Phil didn't use metaphors when writing his songs. He wrote at the microphone as if he were removing his own skin. And millions of youth felt seen because of that. Every major metal festival featured Pantera as the main act following their creative achievement of obscene exhibition of force. The release of Far Beyond Driven in 1994, however, marked their real zenith. It was an album that defied logic because it was so harsh and unabashedly gloomy. However, it immediately rose to the top of the charts. One above pop, grunge, and alternative performers on the Billboard 200. It was an unmatched achievement in the history of metal. But there was a cost to that achievement. The band was getting stronger, but Phil was losing his mind. Unresolved emotional wounds, untreated back ailments, and years of non-stop touring drove him to the brink. He began using strong medicines to dull the ache. When those failed, he resorted to heroin. At first, nobody was aware. Still dominated the audience like a crazy preacher while roaring like a wild animal on stage. But the story behind the scenes was different. He started to distance himself from the band, missing interviews, and becoming increasingly unidentifiable. Phil's relationship with the Abbott brothers, Daryl and Vinnie Paul, began to deteriorate. Although they continued to perform together and grin for the cameras, they ceased working on new songs. The beer conversations were over. On July 13, 1996, following a performance in Dallas, the breaking point occurred. Phil Anselmo slipped into cardiac collapse for almost 5 minutes after overdosing on heroin just hours before his performance. The band believed they had permanently lost him. However, Phil miraculously lived. The event frightened fans and horrified the media. It wasn't a wake-up call, though, for Phil. In a slow-motion self-destruction, this is only another milestone. Pantera's darkest, angriest, and most intimate album, The Great Southern Trendkill, was released in the same year. Interestingly, Phil recorded the majority of his vocals in New Orleans separately, apart from the other band members who were in Texas. An internal fracture was seen. Although it was no longer a cohesive entity, Pantera was still there on paper. Tracks like Suicide Note Part 1 and 2, and Floods, which exposed Phil's darkest sides, were included on the album. No longer were the lyrics weapons against the earth. They reflected the inner turmoil that was tearing him to pieces. Those who paid close attention could sense it. This was not merely a musical declaration. It was an appeal for aid. A protracted period of stillness ensued. For numerous years, Pantera's operations essentially stopped. Down and Superjoint Ritual were two of Phil's side projects that tapped into an even darker, more ominous, and threatening aspect of his sound. Meanwhile, it became impossible to ignore the distance between him and Dimebag Darrell. The fraternity they had vanished into distrust and then subdued animosity. 2003 saw the official dissolution of Pantera. No big news conference, no statements, just a silent cut that hurts like an unhealing wound. The guy who had formerly given Pantera its soul, Phil Anselmo, was now thought to have murdered it. Phil Anselmo did not bid Pantera farewell, hold a press conference, or provide an explanation following the unofficial breakup in 2003. He merely vanished. That stillness, however, was not the end. In addition to being an introspective retreat, it marked the start of a new journey. One in which music was a confession, a scar that remained, a punishment he put on himself, rather than a cry of wrath against the outside world. As fans continued to mourn Pantera's passing, Phil was covertly establishing a new, more brutal, violent, and intimate empire. In the mid-1990s, he rejoined the band Down, which he had started with close New Orleans mates like Pepper Keenan, Corrosion of Conformity, and Jimmy Bauer, I Hate God. In 1995, their first album, NOLA, was already regarded as a cult classic. However, Phil really used Down as a conduit to unload all of his broken parts into music in the years following Pantera. Pantera was not like Down at all. There was no burning or flaming. It slithered, heavy, sorrowful, and dark. Sludge metal from the south, where anger simmered like fire in your hand instead of exploding, and grief moaned instead of screaming. With albums like Down 2, A Bustle in Your Hedgerow, 2002, and Down 3, Over the Under, 2007, Phil started narrating his life's events through music, incorporating every riff, beat, and lengthy breath into the songs rather than through interviews or memoirs. In addition to Down, Phil founded a new band called Superjoint Ritual, which is more raucous, chaotic, and fierce than anything he has ever performed. This band wasn't there to perform. There was a purging. In Superjoint, Phil yelled about addiction, sleepless nights with no way out, and times when his heart stopped and he wasn't sure he would wake up again. It was like a frothing mouth. The music of Superjoint was difficult to listen to. It was like putting acid on a wound, but to those who understood, it was the epitome of honesty. He continued after that. Phil started a solo band called Phil Anselmo and the Illegals, in which he served as the sole songwriter, producer, and communicator. With albums such as Choosing Mental Illness as a Virtue, 2018, and Walk Through Exits Only, 2013, Phil explored his turbulent inner world in greater detail than ever. The outbursts were not merely a matter of vocal technique, they were the result of a man struggling with the question, do I still deserve to be heard? However, Phil's most understated but significant contribution following Pantera was probably the establishment of Housecore Records, a label that allowed him to support scores of underground bands from sludge, doom, and death metal in addition to releasing his own music. For him, this was a duty rather than an investment. He said, "If I've survived everything, then I have a responsibility to open the door for others still screaming in the dark." Though long removed from commercial spotlight, Phil continues to tour, no longer in stadiums of tens of thousands, but in smaller venues where the crowd is close enough to see the wrinkles on his forehead. He doesn't try to recreate Pantera. He doesn't relive the screams of youth. What he brings to the stage now is rawness, a man knocked down by life standing not to triumph, but simply to prove he's still alive. With every project, every song, Phil seems to be writing his own will. A legacy that doesn't sparkle, isn't easily digestible, but lingers hauntingly. He once said, "I know I've hurt a lot of people. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want that. When someone listens to my music, they understand that I tried." For some, that's not enough. For others, it's the only thing that matters. Personal life. When the stage lights dimmed and the final drumbeat faded, Phil Anselmo returned to a completely different world. No audience, no screaming, just a cold room, a body wrecked by pain, and a mind shattered by memories no one but him could truly understand. If the stage was where Phil fought with screams, then his personal life was a silent battlefield. One where he lost over and over again. Since the mid-1990s, Phil had been living with excruciating back pain caused by spinal injuries, the result of overperforming, falling off stage, and years of relentless physical strain. Doctors had advised him to rest completely, but instead, Phil chose to swallow handfuls of opioids, then turned to hard liquor, and finally, heroin. A drug that, as he once put it, temporarily killed the pain without having to think about tomorrow. For years, he lived a routine of self-poisoning, then stepped on stage like nothing had happened until his body could no longer take it. But drugs weren't the only thing eating away at Phil. Fame, adoration, and the image of being untouchable had turned him into a shell. Inside was a man who no longer knew how to love anyone, including himself. His personal life became closed off and cold. He was once married to Stephanie Opal Weinstein, a blues musician and longtime friend with whom he founded the project Southern Isolation, a band with a gloomy, lethargic tone that mirrored Phil's mood at the time. But the marriage didn't last. Phil was still too consumed by addiction, the stage, and his personal demons. He let love slip away as if it were inevitable. Phil has no children. When asked about it, he didn't dodge the question. On the contrary, he answered with brutal honesty. "I didn't want to bring a life into this world when I couldn't even control my own. I used to think I didn't deserve to be a father, and I still think that." Loneliness became the default state of Phil Anselmo's life in the years after Pantera. In the early 2000s, he lived reclusively in a house on the outskirts of New Orleans. Away from crowds, rarely seen in public outside of music projects. The death of Dimebag Darrell in 2004, who had once been a friend, bandmate, and brother on stage, felt like a knife driven straight into his heart. Though they hadn't been close for years, Phil never imagined their story would end with a cold-blooded onstage murder. After Dimebag's death, Phil became one of the most divisive figures in the metal community. Many blamed him for previous angry comments where he had said someone should give Dime a lesson, a statement he insisted was impulsive and never meant with malice. He apologized publicly, he wept on live television, he reached out to the Abbott family with deep remorse, but the apology was never accepted. Vinnie Paul, Dime's brother, cut off all contact with Phil until his own death in 2018. For many years, Phil lived like an exile from the very community he once ruled. But it was also during this time that he began quietly trying to rebuild, not with headlines or media campaigns, but with small actions. He started getting clean, he began eating healthier, he adopted pets, tended a garden, and with his longtime partner Kate Richardson, a music manager and one of the few constant companions in his life, began piecing together what was left of his life. Kate didn't just help Phil find balance, she became the only person who made him believe he still deserved to live. Phil Anselmo's name is still often followed by controversy. The 2016 incident, when he raised a Nazi salute and shouted "White Power" on stage at a festival, reignited public outrage. Once again, Phil bowed his head and apologized, calling it a stupid, drunken, indefensible act. And once again, his fans were left to wonder, has Phil really changed? The answer, perhaps, doesn't lie in his statements, but in the quiet things he's done since, the small-scale tours, the speeches about mental health, the rare moments of reflection on his past, and the apology to Dimebag he never stopped carrying with him. Phil Anselmo. A man who once reached the heights through screams, has spent most of his life in silence. And yet, it is in that silence that we see him most clearly. Alone, weary, but never fully defeated. Present life. Nearly 3 decades after the fiery days of Pantera, Phil Anselmo is still here. Not as a living legend, but as a weathered ghost, still learning how to exist amid the wreckage of what was once destroyed. He no longer seeks the spotlight, doesn't chase trends, and certainly doesn't cling to old glories. Yet, in the quiet of New Orleans, still lives, still writes music, still screams, but in a wholly different way. In 2024, just when many believed Phil had fully retreated into the shadows, he unexpectedly resurfaced with Scour, an extreme metal band with a ferocious lineup. That entire year, they performed only one show at Southport Hall in Louisiana, like a secret ritual with almost no promotion, no fanfare, no spectacle. But for those present, it was like a prayer made of sound, dark, intense, and brutally honest. That same year, Phil maintained one of his odd yet signature traditions, building a haunted house for Halloween open to local residents. In behind-the-scenes footage, he's seen wearing a hard hat, carrying wooden planks, stringing up ropes. No longer a proud metal icon, but a middle-aged man quietly finding joy in small things. Phil once said, "Demons aren't nearly as scary as what people have done to each other. But if I can make someone laugh or scream, that's a kind of salvation, too." In 2025, Phil surprised fans again when Scour released their debut full-length album Gold on February 21, featuring Gary Holt, Slayer, Exodus on the track Coin. The album is a declaration, heavy, feral, but also deeply introspective. Gold isn't just sonic violence. It plays like a shredded diary, capturing the final chapters of someone who once stood in the eye of the storm. Most notably, Phil officially reunited Pantera in a way no one had seen before. Alongside original bassist Rex Brown, with Zakk Wylde replacing Dimebag Darrell and Charlie Bonanti replacing Vinnie Paul, they launched a summer tour across the U.S. beginning in July 2025. Many called it a Pantera tribute, but to Phil, it was a public act of repentance. A chance to say goodbye to the past, not with tears, but with riffs and the last screams he had left. Not everyone approved. Thousands of voices still criticize. Some still refuse to forgive. But at each show, when the spotlight falls on Phil's aging face, gray hair, and deep-set eyes, people no longer see someone trying to conquer. They see a soul trying to sing what was never said to the brother he lost. Outside of music, Phil's daily life has become strangely simple. He still lives with longtime partner Kate Richardson, his music manager and the quiet companion of his later years. No children, no scandals, no loud declarations, just pets, plants, the underground bands he mentors through Housecore Records, and a home where music still echoes from the downstairs room every night. Phil Anselmo no longer screams out of rage. He sings like a prayer. For the souls lost, the mistakes that can't be undone, and for himself, the last man standing from a band that once screamed for an entire generation. Phil Anselmo is not a hero. He never tried to be a role model. He made mistakes, serious ones, sometimes inexcusable. He's hurt others, destroyed himself, pushed himself to the very edge of darkness. But one thing has never changed. He never ran from any of it. From the blazing stages with Pantera to small shows for a few hundred people, from drug overdoses that stopped his heart to silent public apologies, from a man who screamed in rage to someone who now sings as if pleading for forgiveness, Phil Anselmo's journey has never been one of invincibility. It is the story of a complex soul trying to rebuild from the ashes he set himself. Today, when Dimebag's guitar lives on only through loudspeakers, when Vinnie Paul has returned to the earth and Pantera remains a quiet monument in the memory of millions, Phil Anselmo is still here, singing with a voice that's tired but heartbreakingly honest. He no longer sings for glory. He sings to preserve the truth, and sometimes that alone is a victory. What do you think about Phil Anselmo's bitter yet profound journey? To you, is he a living legend? A fallen man who found the strength to rise again? Or simply a human being carrying too many scars to ever forget? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stirred something in you, anger, sorrow, or empathy, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, so we can continue exploring the lives of rock and roll souls who once shook an entire generation.